Hi, I'm Bill O'Reilly. Thanks for watching us tonight. Putin wins. That is the subject of this evening's Talking Points memo. It is now clear that President Obama and the rest of the world will not punish Russia and Putin for seizing the Crimea. A few wishy-washy sanctions have been put in place, nothing substantial. And today in Holland, the president confirmed that. However, if Putin seizes more of Ukraine, Mr. Obama says he'll get tough.
Should Russia go further, such sectoral sanctions would be appropriate. And that would include areas potentially like energy or finance or arms sales or trade that exists between Europe and the United States and Russia.
The president looks exhausted, doesn't he? The American public does not seem disenchanted with the president on the issue. A new CBS News poll says 61% of Americans believe the USA has no responsibility to do something about the Russian-Ukrainian situation. And 65% do not want the president to provide military aid to Ukraine. Very high numbers, so what's going on? After Iraq and Afghanistan, Americans are rightfully fearful of becoming involved with another international conflict. But there's a lot more in play here than most Americans know. As Talking Points has said, what Putin does will influence what Iran does, what China does, and what North Korea does. Thus, the weak response to Putin sends a signal of weakness to the villains of the world. I'm not talking about military action here. I'm suggesting that much tougher economic sanctions be imposed on Russia. Right now, Putin is winking at Joseph Stalin as Russian expansionism is on the march. And what about President Obama's attitude toward our military? While Putin has expanded the Russian military budget by 79%, the president's cutting back meaningful military programs here in America. He wants to downsize the Army, eliminate many Tomahawk missiles. Most of our naval fleet is not even in use, and generally we are a much weaker nation militarily than we were 5 years ago. Putin knows that. He knows Barack Obama has no appetite for confrontation. Therefore, all Americans should expect the world to get much more turbulent as Iran and other rogue nations unleash aggression. Of course, that'll affect all of us because every time there's a controversy overseas, the economy takes a hit. Gas prices go up. What Congress should do immediately is to bolster military spending and oversee our armed forces so they become a true deterrent. The stronger a nation is, the less likely it will be challenged. Right now, Russia doesn't fear the West. Iran believes it can develop a nuke and nothing will happen. And China's just waiting to seize more territory. Hello, Tibet. Grim doesn't even come close. And that's the memo. Now for the top story tonight, reaction joining us from Washington, Fox News political analyst Charles Krauthammer, author of the very big book, Things That Matter. So where am I going wrong here, Charles?
I'm afraid to say you're going right. Obama really looks weak, and the allies know he's weak. The Russians know he's weak. The allies in the rest of the world outside of Europe are scared to death. And our adversaries are emboldened. There's no question about it. And Obama has this sort of ridiculous rhetorical bravado. Today, he actually said in exactly that press conference that Russia was just a regional power, we're a superpower, and that it was acting out of weakness. Acting out of weakness, he just became the first person in history to take the Crimean Peninsula without a shot, without a fatality, without so much as a sprained ankle in his army. Crimea is soaked in the blood of armies who have marched in and out over the centuries, and he did it for free. And Obama's now saying, well, if you go into the rest of Ukraine, we're going to get really tough with sanctions. That's exactly what he said 10 days ago before he took over Crimea. There is no reason in the world Putin should fear anything from the United States, because under this president, who says he'll do X, Y, and Z, that there's a red line here and there's a red line there, and then he'll get really tough. The world knows what happens with red lines. They disappear the moment they're crossed.
All right, now, let's look at the American public, who overwhelmingly doesn't want any action by America in defense of Ukraine. So the president knows that. He can read the polls. He knows that Merkel, Germany, and the rest of Europe not going to back him on sanctions. He doesn't want to be out there alone with the American people telling him not to do anything. So if you were the president, Charles, taking those two things into consideration, what would you do?
This is not the first time in American history when the Poles, the public, was not interested, did not want to get involved, didn't even want to prepare for foreign conflicts. The United States was famously and widely isolationist in the 1930s, but it had a leader called Franklin Roosevelt who could see what was happening in Europe, who knew that America cannot escape the turmoil in Europe, and who therefore provided the leadership to prepare the United States to get it at least somewhat ready when the reckoning finally came. Without FDR, we would not even have begun to be able to respond to the Japanese and to the Germans after Pearl Harbor. Leadership, of course, Americans don't want war. They don't want involvement. And why should they? Bismarck once explained the blessed position of the United States geographically by saying that we're the only great power in history that is bordered on two sides by weak and friendly neighbors, and on the other two sides by fish. Compare us geographically to Poland or the Czech Republic or France or Russia or Germany. People once said that Poland, between the two world wars, was like living in Poland was like living on the median strip of I-95. German tanks and Russian tanks going every which way.
Okay.
So there's no inclination for us to get involved.
I understand.
That's why we have a president and not a computer at the head of the country that reads the polls.
All right. Now, President Obama must know intellectually, in his heart, that he is perceived now as a weak leader. He's got to know that. What do you say about it?
Well, you know, I would hope so, and I would think so. My worst fear is that he doesn't, and I'm beginning to think that he doesn't.
So he's living in a delusional state?
He's living in a fantasy world very clearly described by him and by his Secretary of State. John Kerry actually says that we're in the 21st century, countries don't go in and invade other countries. Well, for God's sake, it's just happened in the 21st century. They look down their noses, meaning the President and Secretary of State, at Putin and say he's a 19th century man. He doesn't understand the rules of the 21st century. Obama and Kerry are the ones living in a fantasy world. Putin is a 19th century man, and using the rules of that century in our century, he's just swallowed the Ukraine without any price whatsoever. He's looking at eastern Ukraine. Right? He's now swallowed, of course, Crimea.
Okay.
He's looking at eastern Ukraine, and he doesn't see anything on the scale coming from the West that would disincline him to take it.
All right. So it's really, as I said in the talking points, it's grim. I mean, and Americans need to understand what's coming down the road. As you aptly pointed out, Franklin Roosevelt saw it. But right now, I don't know.
You need a president who understands, and then a president who's willing to lead, despite the polls, to change the polls. Reagan also changed the polls.
All right. Charles Gradham, everybody. Next on the Rundown, Ed.